In the early morning hours of July the 18th, 2007, 135 of us crossed the border from Texas into Mexico on our way to Cuba. We were from men and women from all walks of life, all ages, professions, and teenagers. And we were traveling to Cuba without a required license by the United States government, the Treasury Department, because of an embargo that had been placed against Cuba and been in place for over 50 years. We were traveling without the license because we protested what we considered to be an unjust and immoral blockade against our Cuban friends. The other thing that we had in common, about the only thing that we shared, of course, was that we were intent on helping and making friends with our Cuban neighbors. And so we had with us 100 tons of humanitarian aid that had been contributed by people all over the United States and Canada. And we called ourselves the Friend Shipment Caravan. We were making friends beyond borders. Crossing into Mexico was not a problem, except the Mexican customs had to examine carefully every item that we had on our manifest for on the vehicles. And because of that careful scrutiny, it took all day. So in the evening, when we finally cleared Mexican customs, we were out to several different of the hotels where we spent a few short hours of sleep, got up the next morning, and drove 350 miles down the eastern shore of Mexico to the port city of Tampico. And when we got there, we took the aid that we had on our vehicles and loaded it onto a freighter. That took us into the wee hours of the morning. And I remember I got barely 2 hours of sleep before we had to be at the airport the following morning, where we boarded a Russian-made Ilyushin 62 jet for a slightly over 2-hour flight to Havana. When we got into the Jose Marti airport, we were met, of course, by the Cuban customs. And when the agent asked me for my passport and my plane ticket, I produced them. He examined them, was satisfied that they were in order, and then he took his stamp and stamped the plane ticket, not the passport. And I knew that he didn't know whether I was traveling legally according to my government or not. And so as not to get me in trouble, instead of putting his stamp in the passport, it was on the ticket. And to this day, my passport does not show that I have been in Cuba. We cleared customs there, walked out of the airport into the warm Cuban sunshine and into the warmth and hospitality of our new Cuban friends. We were put on several buses. Many of buses had been contributed a few years back by people in the United States. And we were taken to 3 different locations. We divided into 3 different groups where we would be hosted for the time that we were in Havana. 2 churches, and one was the Martin Luther King Jr. Center. The aid that we had loaded on the freighters would come later, and that would be received and distributed at the Martin Luther King Center by a coalition of the Cuban government and the Cuban Council of Churches, and the aid would be sent to where it was most needed, cut down greatly on any promise of a black market. We were greeted that evening was by a special performance by a dance review, and everywhere we went we were welcomed. Welcome, we love you, we love Americans. And because we had traveled with a group called Pastors for Peace and had made many trips there before, there were a lot of people who knew us by our names. And from that welcoming for the dance review that night until we left our last evening, after we had observed the graduation ceremony of the Cuban medical school, it was a whirlwind or an exciting blur, depending on your point of view, of touring community centers, hospitals, art museums. We worshiped at a Presbyterian church in Sanctus Spiritu. We ate Cuban foods. We danced at block parties. And we were exhausted but exhilarated. It was an exciting time for us, but a tiring time. By the time we had finished the few days, we had gone down into, during the process, we'd gone down into 3 different provinces. So we got a good overview of the Cuban people and society. We got up back into Havana, and we got up and made arrangements to on our flight back into Tampico. And as we got back on the plane, we had almost forgotten, in our euphoria of the trip, the experience, we'd almost forgotten what might be waiting for us as we tried to cross the border back into Texas. The embargo that the United States has placed on Americans traveling and trading with Cuba potentially carries a substantial fine and even possible imprisonment. Well, we made our way again. It was another day's trip from Tampico back into Reynosa. Spent the night, got up early the next morning, and presented ourselves at the border. We were all wearing a special Cuban t-shirts, so there was no secret about where we had been. We were processed as a group. And I remember the agent Jimenez was the one who interviewed me. He asked me for my customs declaration and for my passport. And we had decided, we had all agreed that we would answer no questions because we didn't want to get into a situation where one question led to another and we would wind up getting more information out than we thought was necessary. I had called a friend of mine, a civil rights lawyer in Colorado Springs, and he had agreed to be on standby in case I needed a lawyer at this point. But actually, as it turned out, we were worried about very little. All of us went through without any problem. Jimenez asked me for my documents, and I presented them. Then he said, "May I see your driver's license?" And I said, "No," and held my breath. And he smiled, handed my documents back, and said, "You're free to go." And within a very short time, we were back on United States soil. It was a fantastic experience. I, to this day, resent the fact that I have to have a license to travel to Cuba. And of course, there are ways to get to Cuba without one, and legally. There are all kinds of exceptions. Governor Heinemann and then Senator Ben Nelson made such a trip in 2005, all with the permission of both governments. And the Cubans have, in spite of a trade embargo, the Cubans have bought millions of dollars worth of agricultural items from Nebraska over the past several years. But it's the fact that the embargo, the law exists, and that average people like you and me, unless we go with a special group for a special purpose, are not permitted to travel legally to Cuba. And I was thinking, I looked up and found out that my English ancestor, whoever he may have been, almost 800 years ago, was granted legally the right to travel to and from England without a license. That was the Magna Carta. And I believe that I should have the same rights, at least, that my ancestor of 800 years ago had. The embargo is not only that keeps people from traveling freely, it's also against nations, friends of us, who themselves trade with Cuba. Just recently, a Dutch travel agency had to pay a $5.9 million fine for arranging travel tours in Cuba, because the company now has a majority interest of United States businesses. That's the story of my travel to Cuba with Pastors for Peace. And I'm told by the people who coordinate this organization that as long as the embargo is in place, we'll keep taking caravans to make friends across the borders. The people in Colorado Springs, when I told them the story after the trip, over the period of the next 5 years, collected and contributed 5 school buses and over $500,000 of humanitarian aid. And the last bus that we sent to Cuba is now being used by the Julio Diaz Orthopedic Hospital. I think that is a wonderful way of making friends across the borders. And I can't help but believe that you do too.